Welcome to Forbidden Lore. There are stories that humanity tells to remember its past, and then there are stories that refuse to stay buried. For thousands of years, the Bible has been read as history, as faith, as divine revelation. But hidden between its lines are events so strange, so unsettling, that they feel less like miracles and more like echoes of something we were never meant to fully understand. A bush that burned without turning to ash. A river that became blood, as if the earth itself were wounded. A sea that split open, not in chaos, but with purpose, as though an unseen force carved a path through the impossible. These are not just moments of wonder, they are disturbances in reality. Because if even one of these events truly happened, then the rules we trust, the laws that govern our world, are not as fixed as we believe. And what if these were not isolated miracles? What if they were signals, clues, fragments of a forgotten pattern stretching across time? A pattern that begins in fire, moves through water, bends nature, commands life and death, and ultimately leads to a moment that changed the fate of humanity forever. Tonight, you are not just listening to ancient stories, you are stepping into a hidden timeline, one where prophets speak to voices in flame, where animals see what humans cannot, where time itself hesitates, and where the boundary between the natural and the divine begins to dissolve. So lower the lights, let the world grow quiet around you, and listen closely, because the deeper we go, the stranger it becomes. And once you begin this journey, there is no turning back. Long before empires carved their names into stone, before kings crowned themselves rulers of men, there were whispers. Whispers carried by desert winds, whispers etched into the memory of a people who walked between fear and faith. They spoke not only of survival, but of encounters with something far beyond human understanding. Our story begins in silence, a silence so vast it stretches across endless sand, broken only by the slow, deliberate steps of a man who had once known power and lost it. Moses had fled everything. He was no longer a prince of Egypt, no longer a man of status or certainty. The palace walls that once sheltered him had become distant echoes, swallowed by the wilderness. Now he walked among rocks and dust, guiding sheep across a land that seemed untouched by time itself. Days blurred into nights, nights into days, until one moment broke the pattern. At first, it seemed small, a flicker in the distance. Fire was not unusual in the desert. Dry brush could ignite beneath the relentless sun. But something about this flame felt different. Moses slowed his steps. The sheep hesitated behind him, restless in a way animals often are when something unseen unsettles the air. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent, not of smoke, but something sharper, almost metallic, almost alive. The bush burned, its branches twisted and glowed, wrapped in fire that moved like liquid light. Yet the leaves did not curl, the wood did not blacken. Nothing was consumed. It was as if the fire had no hunger, as if it existed not to destroy, but to reveal. Drawn by something he could not name, Moses stepped closer. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself resisted his approach. The world around him grew strangely still. Even the wind seemed to retreat, leaving behind a silence that pressed against his ears. Then, a voice not carried by air, not shaped by distance. It did not come from the sky, nor from the earth. It came from within the fire itself, calling his name. Once, then again. And in that moment, everything changed. Because the voice did not simply speak, it knew him. It knew his past, his fear, the life he had tried to leave behind. It spoke with an authority that felt older than the desert, older than the mountains that stood unmoving beneath the endless sky. Moses stood frozen, caught between terror and awe. The fire continued to burn, steady and eternal, as if time itself had paused to witness this encounter. And then came a command. Remove your sandals, for the ground beneath you is no longer ordinary. It is difficult to understand what that truly means. How can earth become holy? How can a place change its nature without changing its form? Yet Moses obeyed. Bare feet against the sand, he stepped into something unseen, something that could not be measured or explained. And from that moment forward, he was no longer simply a man wandering the wilderness. He had become part of something far greater, a story that would reshape nations. But the fire in the bush was only the beginning, because far away, beyond the desert, a kingdom stood at the height of its power. Egypt, a land of monuments and gods, of rulers who believed themselves eternal. The Nile flowed like a living artery through its heart, feeding its people, sustaining its life. To Egypt, the river was not just water. It was stability. It was order. It was control. And then, the river changed. It began subtly, a discoloration at the edges, a faint shift in the current. Fishermen noticed first. Their nets came up heavy, but not with life. The fish inside thrashed weakly, their bodies slick and wrong. The smell followed. Rot, thick and suffocating, spreading across the riverbanks, creeping into homes, clinging to the air. Then came the transformation. Before the eyes of those who depended on it, the Nile turned. Not cloudy, not dark. Red. Deep, unnatural red, like blood spilled across the surface of the world. Fish floated lifeless. The water could not be drunk. Those who touched it recoiled, as though the river itself had become hostile to human life. Panic spread quickly, because this was not just a disaster. It was a violation. The Nile was supposed to be constant, predictable, sacred. But now it had become something else, something that no priest could explain, something no ruler could command back into place. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, the man who had once fled Egypt had returned, carrying with him the memory of a fire that did not consume. Yet even this was not the end of the disturbance, because when the river could no longer sustain life, something else rose to take its place. They came at night. At first only a few. Frogs emerging from the dying waters, dragging themselves onto land. Harmless creatures, small and insignificant. Until they were not. More followed, then more. An endless tide of living bodies pouring from the riverbanks, spreading across fields, roads, and into the very heart of human life. They filled the streets. They covered the ground so completely that each step crushed something beneath it. They slipped through doorways, invaded kitchens, climbed into beds. People woke to find them beside their faces, their skin cold, their eyes unblinking. The sound was constant, a chorus of croaking that never faded, never softened, rising and falling like a living storm. There was no escaping them. Fire could not stop them. Walls could not keep them out. They were everywhere. And the more they multiplied, the more unbearable the world became. What had once been a symbol of life in the river had turned into something overwhelming, suffocating, almost deliberate in its intrusion, as if nature itself had lost its balance, or worse, as if it had been commanded to change. In the palace, fear began to take root, not the fear of enemies or rebellion, but something deeper, the fear that the world itself was no longer behaving as it should. Because one event could be dismissed, two could be endured, but this was a pattern, a progression. First, the fire that did not consume, then the water that became something else entirely, and now, life emerging in unnatural abundance, spilling beyond its boundaries, refusing to be contained. It was as though an unseen force was testing the limits of reality, bending it, reshaping it, one step at a time. And for those who lived through it, there was no way to know what would come next. Only the growing certainty that whatever had begun in the wilderness was no longer confined to it. The desert had whispered, Egypt had answered, and the world was starting to change. The world does not break all at once. It bends, slowly, quietly, almost gently at first. What began as fire that refused to consume, what followed as water that became something unrecognizable, had already begun to shift the balance of everything people thought they understood. But the next moment would not be quiet. It would divide the world itself. The night air carried tension, not the kind born from war, but something heavier, something unseen pressing down on every living thing. The land of Egypt, once defined by certainty and power, now stood at the edge of something it could neither control nor comprehend. And far beyond its cities, beyond its temples and monuments, a vast body of water waited. The Red Sea. Endless, unmoving, impenetrable. To the people who stood before it, it was not just an obstacle. It was the end. Behind them, the distant thunder of chariots rolled across the earth. The sound grew louder with each passing moment, a reminder that escape was no longer a possibility. The army of Egypt, relentless and disciplined, closed the distance with cold precision. Ahead, only water, no path, no bridge, no hope. Fear spread quickly. Voices rose in panic, breaking the fragile silence. Some turned back, staring toward the approaching army with dread. Others looked forward, their eyes searching the surface of the sea as if willing it to change. But water does not move for human fear. It does not part for desperation. And yet, something began to happen. At first, it was the wind, a low, steady force that moved across the surface of the sea. It did not gust or shift. It held its direction, constant and unyielding, as though guided by intention rather than chance. The water trembled, not violently, but with a strange, controlled motion. Ripples formed, then deepened, pulling back, drawing away from a single invisible line. The ground beneath the water began to emerge, slowly, impossibly. The sea was opening. Walls of water rose on either side, towering and silent, held in place by something no eye could see. They did not crash. They did not collapse. They stood like barriers, like boundaries drawn between two realities. And between them, a path. Dry, untouched by the chaos that should have followed. For a moment, no one moved. Because the human mind resists what it cannot explain. It hesitates when faced with something that should not exist. Then, one step. Then another. And soon the people began to walk into the sea. The ground beneath their feet was firm, though moments before it had been buried beneath waves. The air felt different there, heavier, charged with something unspoken. On either side, the walls of water loomed, shifting slightly, as though alive but restrained. Children clung to their parents, eyes darted upward, watching the impossible held in place above them. Every step carried both hope and the quiet, lingering fear that at any moment the sea might remember what it was and return to it. But it did not. Not yet. The crossing continued, an entire people moving through a space that should never have existed. And when the last of them reached the other side, the world shifted again. The wind changed, the walls trembled, and the sea returned. Not gently, not slowly, but with force. The path vanished. The water collapsed inward, reclaiming what had been taken from it. The sound was overwhelming, final, leaving no trace of the road that had once divided it. Only silence remained, and the understanding that something had just occurred that could not be undone. But even as the sea closed behind them, the question remained. How long can a people survive in a world where reality itself has begun to change? The desert stretched before them, vast, empty, unforgiving. Days passed, then more. The initial awe of survival faded, replaced by something far more immediate: hunger. It began as a dull ache, easily ignored, but as time moved forward, it sharpened, growing more persistent, more demanding. There were no fields here, no rivers to draw life from, only sand and stone beneath an endless sky. Voices began to rise again, not in panic this time, but in doubt. Had they escaped one impossible fate, only to walk into another? The memory of the sea still lingered, but it did not fill empty stomachs. It did not quiet the growing fear that survival might not be possible in this place. And then, the morning came. It was subtle at first, a thin layer across the ground, barely noticeable in the early light. Like dew, but not quite. It covered the surface of the desert in delicate patterns, stretching farther than the eye could see. People stepped forward cautiously. They knelt, reached out, touched it. It was unlike anything they had known. Light, almost weightless. Fine, like flakes, yet solid enough to gather. When they lifted it in their hands, it did not melt away. It remained. They tasted it, and for the first time in days, there was relief. It was food, but not grown, not hunted, not made by human hands. It had appeared from nowhere. Each morning it returned, covering the ground as if placed there with intention, measured and precise, never too much, never too little. Enough to sustain, but never to store beyond its time. It could not be hoarded. It could not be controlled. It simply was. A provision that defied every natural process they understood. Some began to wonder, not just where it came from, but how. Because this was not like the sea. The sea had been a moment, a single, overwhelming act. This was continuous, a quiet, repeating pattern, as if something unseen walked with them, sustaining them step by step, day by day. Yet even that would not be enough, because hunger is only one part of survival. The body demands more, and soon thirst followed. Water in the desert is not simply scarce, it is life itself. Without it, the body weakens quickly, movement slows, thoughts become heavy, clouded by a single consuming need. The people searched, but there was nothing. No hidden streams, no sudden springs, only dry land stretching endlessly in every direction. The tension returned. Voices rose once more, sharper this time, edged with desperation. Had they been led here, only to perish? And then, once again, something impossible stood before them. A rock, unremarkable in every way, solid, lifeless, unyielding. There was no reason to believe it held anything more than what it appeared to be, and yet it became the center of attention. Moses stepped forward. The memory of the fire, the voice, the sea, all of it seemed to gather into this single moment. He raised his hand and struck the rock. The sound echoed sharply across the barren land. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then, a crack. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough. From within the stone, something shifted. And then it came. Water. Clear, flowing, unstoppable. It burst forth with force, spilling over the surface, carving its own path across the dry ground. It did not trickle. It did not hesitate. It poured, as if the rock had never been empty at all, as if something had been waiting inside it, held back until that precise moment. The people rushed forward, disbelief giving way to relief as they drank. The water was cool, real, undeniable. Life from stone. It should not have been possible. But then again, neither had the fire, nor the blood in the river, nor the sea that had opened, nor the food that appeared with the morning. One by one, the boundaries of the natural world had been crossed, not shattered, but rewritten. And as the people stood there, surrounded by the evidence of something beyond their understanding, a question lingered, not spoken aloud, but felt. If the world could change like this, if reality itself could be shaped, guided, although, then what else was possible? And perhaps more importantly, what was coming next? There is a moment in every journey when the unknown stops feeling distant and begins to feel aware. By now, the pattern could no longer be ignored. Fire that spoke, water that transformed, seas that opened, food that appeared from nothing, stone that released life. These were not accidents. They were responses to movement, to decisions, to something unfolding step by step across time. And yet, not all signs came through elements as vast as oceans or as overwhelming as the sky. Some came quietly, through creatures most would never think to question. The road stretched long and uneven beneath the hooves of a donkey. It was an ordinary journey. At least, it was meant to be. Balaam rode with confidence, his posture steady, his thoughts fixed on the task ahead. He was a man known for his ability to perceive what others could not, a man who listened for voices beyond the human world. And yet, on that day, he did not see what stood directly before him. The donkey slowed. At first it seemed like hesitation, a small disruption in an otherwise steady pace. Balaam tightened his grip, urging the animal forward. But the donkey did not obey. Its ears pulled back, its body stiffened. Every instinct within it resisted the path ahead. There was something there, something unseen. But not to the donkey. The animal stepped aside, moving off the road, its breath quickening. Balaam's frustration rose immediately. To him, there was nothing there, no obstacle, no danger, only disobedience. He struck the donkey. The sound echoed sharply, breaking the quiet rhythm of the journey. The animal cried out, not in rebellion, but in fear. And still, it would not move forward. Again Balaam forced it. Again the donkey resisted. The air itself felt different now, heavy, pressed with a presence that had not yet revealed itself to human eyes. The path narrowed. On one side, stone. On the other, a drop that vanished into shadow. The donkey froze. There was nowhere left to turn. Balaam's anger surged. He struck the animal again, harder this time, his voice rising in sharp commands that cut through the stillness. And then, everything changed. The donkey turned its head, not in the way animals do when startled, but with intention, with focus. Its eyes met his, and then it spoke. Not a sound, not a cry, words, clear, shaped, unmistakably human. A voice where no voice should exist. Balaam did not recoil, he did not question, because in that moment, something deeper than logic took hold. He answered, as though this was simply the next step in a world that had already begun to unravel. The donkey spoke again, its tone carrying something almost like sorrow. It questioned him, not with confusion, but with awareness, with memory of every step it had taken faithfully before this moment. Why strike me? Why now? The air trembled, and then the unseen became visible. Before them stood a figure, not formed of flesh in the way humans understand it, but undeniable in presence, radiant yet sharp, still yet filled with power restrained. An angel. Positioned directly in the path, unmoving, its existence cutting through the space like a boundary that could not be crossed. The donkey had seen it all along. Balaam had not. Until now. The weight of realization fell heavily. Not only had he failed to see what stood before him, he had struck the very creature that had saved his life. Because what the animal feared had been real, and what it refused to face had not been emptiness. It had been judgment. The world shifted again in that moment, not with fire, not with water, but with perception. Because, for the first time, it became clear that humans were not the only ones capable of awareness, that the boundary between instinct and understanding was not as solid as it seemed, and that sometimes it was not humans who saw the truth first, but the creatures walking quietly beside them. The journey continued, but the memory remained. A voice from an animal, a vision that appeared only when it was too late to deny. Another fracture in the structure of reality. And yet, even this would not compare to what came next, because if perception itself could shift, if sight could be given or withheld, then the flow of the world could also be stopped. The Jordan River moved with quiet strength. Unlike the sea, it did not roar. It did not stretch endlessly across the horizon. But its current was constant, unyielding in its direction, shaped by time and gravity in ways that could not be easily altered. To cross it, especially at its height, was no simple task. The waters ran deep, fast, cold. And yet, once again, a people stood at its edge, waiting. The priests stepped forward first. They carried with them something more than physical weight. The ark rested upon their shoulders, a symbol, a presence, something that had followed them through every impossible moment before. They approached the water slowly, each step deliberate, measured. The current continued as it always had, indifferent to human intention, until the moment their feet touched the edge. It began almost imperceptibly. A hesitation, a shift in the flow. Then, something impossible. The water stopped. Not gradually, not naturally. It halted, as if an unseen hand had pressed against it, holding it in place. The current that had once moved freely now stood still, gathering, rising, forming a boundary far upstream. Below, the riverbed revealed itself. Wet, then drying, then firm. A path once hidden beneath constant motion now lay open, waiting. The people moved forward. Step by step, they crossed the place where water should have been. The air felt charged, as though the river itself was aware of what was happening, restrained by a force it could not resist. Children looked back, watching the wall of water held in place. Adults walked with careful steps, their minds caught between disbelief and acceptance. Because this was no longer unfamiliar. They had seen the sea open. Now, they watched a river obey. Different scale, same pattern. Nature, responding, bending, pausing, until the moment passed. When the last foot left the riverbed, the release came. The water surged forward once more, reclaiming its path, erasing the evidence of what had just occurred. Flow returned, as though nothing had happened, as though the river had never stopped at all. But those who crossed knew otherwise. They carried the memory. Another moment where the impossible had not only occurred, but repeated. Because that was the most unsettling part. Not that it happened once, but that it could happen again and again. Each time the boundary moved further. First fire, then water, then life, then perception. Now, the flow of an entire river. What remained untouched, what rule still stood unbroken. The pattern continued to unfold, quietly, relentlessly. And somewhere beyond what could be seen, something was still watching, still guiding, still waiting for the next moment to arrive. There are forces in this world that shape what we believe to be unchangeable. Time, sound, stone. They feel permanent, fixed, bound by rules that no human hand can reach. And yet, there came a moment when even these began to bend. It began under a sky that should have followed its course without hesitation. The sun had risen, as it always did, casting light across the land, marking the steady passage of hours. Shadows stretched and shifted, moving slowly, predictably, as though guided by an invisible clock that had never once failed. But on that day, something interrupted it. A battle was unfolding, not just between armies, but between outcomes that could not coexist. Victory or defeat would shape everything that followed. There was no time for uncertainty, and yet, time itself was slipping away. The light began to fade toward its natural end. The sun moved along its path, descending as it had done for countless days before. Darkness approached, inevitable, unchallenged. Until a voice rose, not in desperation, but in command. Joshua stood among his people, his gaze fixed not on the enemy, but on the sky itself. He did not plead, he did not hesitate. He spoke, and what he asked for was not small. He called for the sun to stand still, to stop, to hold its place in the sky, as though the movement of the heavens could simply be paused. There was no reason for this to happen, no force on earth that could reach so far beyond itself. And yet, the moment did not pass. The sun did not continue its descent. It remained, suspended. Light held its position across the land, refusing to fade. Shadows stopped where they were, frozen in place, no longer shifting, no longer marking the passage of time. The sky had become still. For those who stood beneath it, the realization came slowly. At first, it felt like a delay, a brief hesitation in the natural rhythm of the world. But as moments stretched longer, as the expected darkness failed to arrive, something deeper settled in. Time was no longer moving as it should. The battle continued under an unmoving sun. Hours passed, but the light did not change. It did not dim. It did not shift. It remained fixed, as though the world itself had been placed on hold. And in that stillness, something unsettling emerged. Because time is not something we see. It is something we feel through change, through movement, through the quiet certainty that one moment leads to the next. But when that movement stops, what remains? For those who lived through it, there was no answer, only the awareness that something had just happened that reached beyond land, beyond water, beyond life itself. The pattern had extended further than ever before, not just into nature, but into the structure of reality. And when the sun finally moved again, when shadows resumed their slow dance across the earth, nothing looked different. And yet, everything had changed. Because once time can be paused, it is no longer absolute. But the bending of time was only one part of what would come next. Because if the sky itself could be commanded, then what of the ground beneath human feet? Stone does not yield. It does not listen. It does not respond. It stands as it is, shaped only by time and force over ages too vast to measure. And yet, there came a moment when even stone could no longer remain unmoved. The city stood, fortified. Jericho. Its walls rose high, thick and unyielding, built to resist every known method of attack. Generations had trusted those walls. They had watched them stand against time, against enemies, against the slow erosion of the world itself. They were not simply barriers. They were certainty. And outside them, a people gathered. But they did not prepare for battle in the way one might expect. There were no siege engines, no battering rams, no scaling ladders. Instead, there was silence. The people began to walk. Around the city. Once, then again. Day after day they circled the walls, their steps steady, their movements deliberate. The city watched from above, confusion growing with each passing circuit. This was not war. This was something else. Something ritualistic. Something patient. On the seventh day, the pattern changed. The air felt different, charged with anticipation that had been building quietly, unseen. The people gathered once more. They walked again, but this time not once. 7 times. The repetition echoed across the land, each step carrying a weight that could not be seen, but could be felt. And then, the sound began. Trumpets. Not chaotic, not random, clear, piercing, sustained. The notes cut through the air, rising above the silence that had defined the days before. They did not strike the walls. They did not touch the stone. And yet, something shifted. The ground trembled, subtly at first, then stronger. The walls did not crack immediately. They held. For a moment longer than seemed possible, as though resisting. as though the very material of them understood what was about to happen and could not prevent it. Then it began. A fracture. Not from impact, not from force applied by human hands, but from something deeper, something internal. The stone gave way, not outward, but inward. Sections of the wall collapsed, falling as though their own structure had betrayed them. The massive barriers that had once defined the city's strength now crumbled into ruin. The sound was overwhelming. Stone breaking, earth shaking. The certainty of permanence dissolving in an instant. And when it ended, the walls were gone. Not worn down, not weakened over time, but brought down in a single moment by something that had never touched them directly. Sound, movement, presence. Call it what one will, but it had changed the nature of stone itself. The pattern continued. Fire that did not consume, water that transformed, seas that opened, food that appeared, life from stone, animals that spoke, rivers that stopped, time that paused. And now, walls that fell without force, each event pushing further, each moment breaking something once believed to be unbreakable. The world was not ending. It was being rewritten. Quietly, precisely, step by step. And as those who witnessed these events moved forward, carrying their memories with them, a question followed. Not loud, not spoken, but always present. If even time, even stone, could be undone, then what part of reality was still beyond reach? Or perhaps there was no such boundary left at all. There is a point when the pattern no longer feels distant, no longer something that happens to nations, to rivers, to distant cities carved from stone. It becomes personal. It begins to move through individuals, through voices, through choices made in moments that seem small, but ripple outward in ways no one can predict. By now, the world had already changed. Fire had spoken. Water had turned. Time had paused. Stone had fallen. But what came next would reveal something even more unsettling. That the same force which shaped oceans could move through a single human voice. The mountain stood silent beneath a wide open sky. Mount Carmel. A place where wind moved freely, carrying with it the quiet tension of a land divided not by borders, but by belief. On one side, many voices. On the other, only one. Elijah stood alone, not as a king, not as a warrior, but as a man who carried something invisible. Something that had followed the pattern long before this moment. Across from him, the prophets of Baal gathered in number. Their presence filled the mountain, their confidence loud, certain, reinforced by the sheer weight of how many stood together. They prepared their offering, an altar built, wood arranged, everything set as it should be. There was only one thing missing: fire. It was a simple challenge. Call upon your God, and let the answer come. The prophets began. Their voices rose together, echoing across the mountain. They called out again and again, their words repeating, growing louder, more desperate as time passed. The sun climbed higher, its heat pressing down, intensifying the strain of the moment. Hours passed. Nothing. No spark, no sign, no response. The air remained empty. The silence between their cries grew heavier, stretching longer each time they stopped to listen for something that never came. Doubt began to creep in. though none dared speak it aloud. Then Elijah stepped forward. Alone, he rebuilt the altar with care, placing each stone deliberately, as though the act itself held meaning beyond what could be seen. Wood was laid, the offering prepared, and then something unexpected. Water. Not a small amount, but enough to soak everything. He poured it over the offering, over the wood, over the stones themselves, until it ran down into a trench surrounding the altar, filling it completely. It was an act that defied logic. Fire consumes dryness, not water. And yet, he continued, until nothing remained untouched. Then, silence. No shouting, no repetition, only a single voice, calm, steady, certain. Elijah spoke. Not to the mountain, not to the people, but to something beyond both. The moment held. The air tightened as though the world itself had drawn in a breath. And then, fire came. Not from below, not sparked by human hands, but from above. It fell, sudden, precise, overwhelming. The flame did not hesitate. It did not struggle against the water. It consumed. The offering, gone. The wood, gone. The stones themselves, blackened, shattered by heat beyond what should have been possible. Even the water in the trench vanished, evaporated in an instant. Nothing remained, only scorched ground and silence. A silence filled not with doubt, but with realization. Because this was not just fire, it was control. Over elements, over conditions, over what should have been impossible. And for those who witnessed it, the pattern became undeniable. The same force that had parted seas, that had stopped rivers, that had held the sun in place, was here, acting through a single voice. But Elijah was not the end of this path, because the pattern did not stop with him. It continued, through another, Elisha. Where Elijah had called down fire, Elisha would reveal something quieter, something smaller, but no less impossible. It began near water. A group of men worked together, building, shaping, creating something from the natural world around them. The sound of tools striking wood echoed softly, rhythmic, ordinary. Until it wasn't. A sudden slip, a sharp sound, and then a loss. The iron axe head flew from its handle, disappearing into the water below. It sank immediately. Heavy, solid, unchanging. Iron does not float. It does not hesitate. It sinks. Always. Panic followed quickly. The man who had lost it knew the weight of what had just happened. It was not simply a tool. It was borrowed. A responsibility now lost beneath a surface that would not return it. Elisha stepped forward, calm, observing. He did not dive into the water. He did not search blindly. Instead, he asked a simple question. Where did it fall? The place was shown, and then something strange. He took a piece of wood, light, fragile, insignificant compared to iron. He threw it into the water. For a moment, nothing happened. The surface rippled, then stilled, and then the impossible. The iron rose, not slowly, not uncertainly. It came up against everything the world dictates, breaking the surface, floating as though its nature had been rewritten. The man reached out, retrieving it with disbelief etched into every movement. Because this was not a grand display. There was no fire, no voice from the sky, just a quiet reversal, a rule undone. Weight made light, nature corrected. And yet, even this was not the limit. Because if matter itself could be altered, then what of sight? What of perception? Not just of one man, but of many. The army moved with purpose. Aram's forces advanced, confident, disciplined, certain of their strength. They had come prepared. But they had not come prepared for what they could not see. Elisha stood apart once more, watching, knowing. The pattern moved through him again, not in spectacle, but in precision. He spoke, not loudly, not with force, but with intent. And in that moment, vision was taken. The soldiers, strong, trained, ready for battle, could no longer see. Not darkness as night brings, but confusion, distortion. The world before them remained, but it no longer made sense. Shapes shifted, paths disappeared, direction lost all meaning. They moved, but without certainty, walked, but without knowing where. An entire army rendered helpless, not by weapons, not by strength, but by the removal of something so fundamental it is rarely questioned: sight. And in their blindness, they were led, guided not by their own will, but by the very man they had come against. Until the moment passed, until their sight returned, and with it, the understanding that something far beyond them had intervened, once again. The pattern deepened. Fire from heaven, matter defying weight, sight given and taken away. Each event more precise, more controlled, more deliberate than the last. No longer vast and overwhelming like the sea, no longer distant like the sun. Now, it moved through individuals, through moments that seemed small, yet carried the same impossible nature. And with each step, the boundary between human and something beyond grew thinner, less defined, until the question could no longer be avoided. Where did one end and the other begin? There are moments when survival itself becomes a question, not of strength, not of intelligence, but of something far more fragile: the boundary between life and destruction. By now, the pattern had already reshaped fire, water, time, and matter. It had moved through prophets, through armies, through the quiet and the overwhelming alike. But what happens when that same force is tested against something designed for only one purpose: to consume? The furnace stood at the center of the plain, massive, sealed, built not for warmth, but for judgment. Its flames roared with unnatural intensity, fed again and again until the heat itself distorted the air around it. Even from a distance, it was unbearable. The ground near its opening glowed faintly, as though the fire within had begun to reach outward, eager to claim more. This was no ordinary fire. It had been made stronger, deliberately, 7 times hotter than usual, as if whoever commanded it wanted to ensure one thing: that nothing placed inside it could possibly survive. 3 men stood before it: Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Their names carried through the gathered crowd, not in honor, but in tension. They had refused to bow, refused to yield. And now, the consequence stood before them. The command was given. They were bound, carried forward. Even the soldiers tasked with bringing them closer felt the force of the heat. It pressed against their skin, stealing breath, burning without touch. And then they were thrown in. The fire surged, a violent response, as though it had been waiting, as though it recognized what had just been given to it. The men disappeared into the furnace, consumed. Or so it should have been. For a moment, no one spoke. The roar of the fire filled the space, drowning out everything else. Then, something shifted. Not in the flames, but in the silence that followed. A voice broke through, not from within the furnace, but from outside it. The king. His tone no longer carried certainty, only confusion, and something else. Fear. Because what he saw did not match what should have happened. He rose, moved closer, peering into the impossible. There were not 3 figures inside the fire. There were 4. The flames continued to burn, violent and consuming as ever, and yet the figures walked. Freely, unbound, their movements calm, untouched by the inferno that surrounded them. The fire did not cling to them, it did not alter them, it simply existed around them, contained, held back, as though something within that furnace had changed its nature entirely. The 4th figure stood among them, unfamiliar, unmistakable, not like the others. There was a presence to it, a stillness that contrasted the chaos of the flames. It did not struggle against the fire, it commanded it. Without movement, without force, simply by being there. The king stepped back. His voice trembled as he called out to the men inside. "Come out!" And they did, walking from the furnace as though stepping from one room into another. The fire remained behind them, still burning, still powerful, and yet it had failed. Not one hair singed, not one garment marked, not even the scent of smoke clung to them. The boundary had been crossed once again. Fire undone. Not extinguished, not weakened, but rendered irrelevant. And for those who witnessed it, the realization was impossible to escape. If even destruction itself could be restrained, then what force was capable of doing so? But the pattern did not stop at survival. It moved further, into something even more unsettling, into a message, one that would not be spoken, but written. The palace was filled with light. Music echoed through its halls. Laughter rose and fell in waves as the feast continued without pause. Gold and silver reflected the glow of countless flames, casting shifting patterns across walls that had seen generations come and go. King Belshazzar sat at the center of it all, confident, unaware. The world beyond his palace walls felt distant, irrelevant compared to the moment he occupied. Wine flowed freely, voices grew louder, and then the command. Bring the vessels. Sacred objects taken long ago, removed from a place of worship, now used as symbols of power, of control over what had once been untouchable. They were brought forward, filled, used without reverence, without hesitation. And in that moment, something changed. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the air, a pause in the rhythm of sound. Then it appeared. Not a figure, not a voice, but a hand, emerging from nothing, suspended in the air beside the wall, visible, undeniable. Writing. The fingers moved with deliberate precision, pressing invisible force into solid surface. Lines formed. Symbols took shape. None present understood the meaning, but all understood one thing. This should not be happening. The music stopped. The laughter died. Silence spread through the hall like a shadow. The king's expression changed. Confidence drained, replaced by something far more raw. Fear. Not of enemies, not of loss, but of the unknown. Because this was not a threat he could face, not something he could command. The hand continued its movement, each stroke final, each mark permanent. And when it finished, it vanished, as though it had never been there at all, leaving behind only the message: unreadable, unexplainable, unavoidable. The king called for answers, for anyone who could interpret what had been written, but knowledge did not come easily. Because this message was not meant to be understood by all. It required something more, something beyond human reasoning alone. When the meaning was finally revealed, it was not comfort. It was not hope. It was an ending, a declaration that what had seemed permanent was not, that power could be taken, that time could run out. That judgment had already been decided. The palace remained, the walls still stood, but something invisible had shifted. The future had been written before it arrived. And for those who heard the interpretation, the weight of it settled deeply. Because this was no longer about elements, no longer about survival. This was about fate. About the unseen forces that not only shape reality, but determine its outcome. Fire had been controlled. Matter had been altered. Sight had been removed. Now the future itself had been revealed, not through prophecy alone, but through something written by a hand that did not belong to this world. The pattern had reached further than ever before, and yet it was not complete. Because beyond survival, beyond warning, there remained one final boundary to cross. Not just escaping death, not just predicting it, but facing it directly, and what comes after. There is a difference between escaping danger and being placed directly inside it. Up to this point, the pattern had shown control over fire, over water, over time, over matter, over perception, even over fate itself. But now, it would move into something far more primal, something older than civilization, something that does not listen, does not reason, does not hesitate. The instinct to kill. Night settled over the kingdom with a stillness that felt heavier than usual, not peaceful, not calm, but waiting. Daniel was led through stone corridors, his footsteps echoing softly, measured, unresisting. There was no struggle in him, no visible fear, only a quiet acceptance of what was about to happen. The decree had been made, and now it would be carried out. The entrance to the den stood before him, dark, silent, but not empty. From within, faint sounds emerged, low, rhythmic. The shifting of massive bodies, the slow scrape of claws against stone. Breathing, deep and steady. Lions, not one, not two. A den filled with them. Creatures built for the hunt, muscles coiled with strength. Teeth designed not just to kill, but to tear. The kind of force no human can stand against. Daniel was lowered inside. The stone was rolled into place above him. And just like that, He was alone. Or so it should have been. The darkness inside the den was thick, pressing in from every side. Shapes moved within it, barely visible, their presence felt more than seen. A lion stepped forward, then another, eyes reflecting faint light, glowing in the shadows. They approached, slowly, deliberately. There was no rush, no hesitation, only instinct. The distance closed. Breath met skin. Hot, heavy, alive. And then, nothing. No attack, no strike, no tearing of flesh. The lions stopped, as though something invisible stood between them and their prey. They circled, restless, confused. Their nature remained, but something restrained it. Daniel stood unmoving, not because he could resist them, but because something else had already done so. The night passed. Outside, time moved forward as it always did, but inside the den, something held, something silent, yet absolute. When morning came, the stone was moved. Light poured in, cutting through the darkness. The king's voice followed, uncertain, almost afraid to hear the answer. Daniel. The question hung in the air, not spoken fully, but understood. Are you alive? From within the den, a voice answered, calm, unshaken. He stepped forward, into the light. Alive, unharmed. The lions remained behind him, still, watching, their power unchanged, yet restrained. The boundary had shifted once again, not just survival in the face of destruction, but the suspension of instinct itself. Predators denied their nature, and for those who witnessed it, the realization settled in deeply. If even instinct can be overridden, then what truly governs the world? But the pattern did not stop at the edge of death. It moved beyond it, into something even more impossible. Because escaping death is one thing. Entering it and returning is another entirely. The sea was calm that day. Waves moved gently, their rhythm steady, predictable, stretching toward the horizon without interruption. Jonah stood at the edge of it all, a man running, not from danger, but from purpose. The command he had been given was clear, and he had chosen to turn away from it. But there are paths, once set in motion, that do not simply disappear. The ship carried him far from where he was meant to be, further with each passing hour, until the sky changed. Clouds gathered with unnatural speed, thick and heavy, swallowing the light. The wind rose not in gusts, but in force. The sea responded immediately, its calm surface breaking into violent motion. The storm was not random. It felt directed, focused. The ship creaked under the strain, wood bending, ropes snapping as waves crashed against it again and again. The crew moved frantically, trying to regain control, but control had already been lost. They knew. Somewhere in the chaos they understood. This was not natural. This was not chance. This was a response. And at the center of it, Jonah. The decision came quickly. He stepped forward, not resisting, not questioning, only accepting. He was cast into the sea. The moment his body struck the water, the storm stopped. Not gradually, not fading. It ended, as though it had never existed at all. The waves calmed, the wind vanished, the sky cleared. The ship remained, The sea returned to stillness. But Jonah disappeared beneath the surface. The water closed above him. Darkness took hold. Silence followed. For a moment, it seemed final, until something moved beneath the depths. Massive, unseen, a shape rising from below, cutting through the water with quiet precision. Then, contact. Jonah was swallowed, not torn apart, not destroyed, but taken, whole, into the body of something far larger than himself. The darkness inside was complete, not like night, not like shadow, but total. A space where time seemed to lose meaning, where the outside world no longer existed. 3 days, 3 nights, no light, no direction, no escape. And yet, life remained. Breath continued. Thought persisted. As though the place he had entered was not meant to kill him, but to hold him, to contain him, to force stillness where there had been movement, to force reflection where there had been escape. And when the time had passed, the creature moved again, rising, breaking the surface. And then, release. Jonah was cast back onto land, alive, unharmed, returned. The boundary had been crossed once more. Not just survival within death, but passage through it, held inside it, then released from it, as though death itself had become a place rather than an end. The pattern now stood at its most unsettling point. Fire controlled, water divided, time paused, stone collapsed, matter altered, sight removed, fate revealed, instinct restrained. Death entered and left behind. What remained? What boundary had not yet been crossed? There was only one, and it would not be delayed much longer, because what comes next would not simply challenge death. It would redefine it. There are moments in history when everything that came before seems to be leading toward a single point. Not a place, not an event, but a presence. By now, the pattern had moved through fire, water, time, matter, perception, instinct, and even death itself. Each moment had stretched the boundaries of what the world could contain, but all of it felt like preparation, as if something greater was approaching, not distant, not hidden, but walking among people. The sea lay quiet beneath a darkened sky. Night had settled in, deep and unbroken, clouds covering what little light the stars might have offered. The wind had begun to rise, not violently, but steadily, creating a restless movement across the surface of the water. A boat drifted in the distance. Inside it, men struggled, not against enemies, but against the elements. The wind pushed against them. The waves resisted every attempt to move forward. Each stroke of effort seemed to be undone the moment it was made. They were not inexperienced. They knew the water. But this felt different. The rhythm was off. The resistance unnatural. Time passed slowly in the darkness. Fatigue began to take hold. And then, one of them saw something. At first, it was nothing more than a shape, distant, unclear, moving. Not with the motion of the waves, but against them. A figure, walking, not beside the water, not through it, but on it. The reaction was immediate. Fear. Not cautious fear, but something deeper, instinctive. The kind that rises when the mind encounters something it cannot place into any known category. Voices rose, uncertain, shaken, because what they saw should not exist. The figure came closer, step by step, each movement steady, unaffected by the shifting surface beneath it. The water did not give way. It did not break. It held, as though it recognized the one who walked upon it. Then, a voice, calm, clear, cutting through the fear without force. "Do not be afraid." The words did not explain. They did not justify what was happening, but they changed something. The fear did not vanish, but it shifted from panic to something else, something closer to awe. The figure reached the boat, close enough now to be seen clearly. Jesus. Not distant, not removed, but present. Standing on the surface that should not support him, the boundary between solid and fluid undone. One of them stepped forward, not fully understanding, but drawn by something beyond reason. He moved toward the edge of the boat. The water below shifted in the darkness, unstable, uncertain. And yet, he stepped out. For a moment, it held, just as it had held before. Step by step, he moved forward, walking, not falling, not sinking, sharing for a brief moment in the same impossible state. Until doubt entered, small, subtle, but enough. The water responded immediately. What had held began to give way. The surface broke beneath him. He sank. The boundary returned, as though it had only been suspended and now resumed. A hand reached out, pulled him back, restored him. The moment passed. The water returned to what it had always been, unstable, untouchable. But something had been revealed. Not just that the natural world could be changed, but that it could respond differently depending on something unseen. Faith, doubt, presence, all interacting with the structure of reality itself. And for those who witnessed it, the realization was undeniable. The pattern had reached a new form. No longer distant events, no longer rare interventions, but something carried within a person, something that moved with them, acted through them, changed the world around them simply by being there. But even this was not the final step. Because walking on water challenges nature. It does not defeat death. And the pattern had one boundary left to cross. It happened in a place of stillness, a tomb, sealed, silent. 4 days had passed. Enough time for certainty to take hold, for the finality of death to settle into the minds of those who remained. Lazarus was gone, not lost, not hidden, but dead. The body had been placed inside, the stone rolled into position, the process complete. There was no expectation of change, no anticipation of reversal, only mourning. And then, Jesus arrived. Not hurried, not desperate, but deliberate. He approached the tomb, the weight of the moment carried in every step. Those around him watched, confusion mixing with grief. Why come now? Why wait until it was too late? The stone stood before them, heavy, immovable, a barrier between the living and the dead. Jesus spoke, not to the crowd, but to those standing closest. "Move the stone." Hesitation followed immediately, not because the task was difficult, but because of what it meant. The tomb had been sealed for days. What lay behind it had already begun to change, to decay, to become something no one wished to see. And yet, the command remained. The stone was moved, the darkness inside revealed. Still, unmoving, silent. Then, a voice, loud, clear, carrying into the space beyond life. "Lazarus, come out." For a moment, nothing. The silence stretched, heavy, uncertain. Then, movement, from within the darkness. A shift, a sound. Something responding. The figure appeared at the entrance, slowly, unsteadily, wrapped in burial cloth, but moving, alive. Step by step, Lazarus emerged from the tomb. 4 days after death had claimed him. Breath returned, life restored. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but physically, undeniably. The boundary had been crossed, not avoided, not delayed, but reversed. Death undone. And for those who stood there, watching the impossible unfold before their eyes, there was no explanation left to reach for, no category to place it in. Because everything that had come before, every fire, every river, every moment of suspended reality, had led here, to this, the restoration of life after it had ended. But even this was not the final step. Because bringing one man back is not the same as overcoming death itself. And that moment was still to come. There is a final boundary, one that every living thing, no matter how powerful, no matter how certain, must eventually face. Death. Not as an idea, not as a story, but as an end. Throughout everything that has come before, the pattern has moved closer to it. Fire was controlled, water was divided, time was paused, matter was altered, sight was taken, fate was revealed, instinct was restrained, and death itself was entered, touched, and even reversed for another. But there is a difference between restoring life to someone else and facing death alone. The city was restless, Jerusalem, crowded, loud, alive with movement, yet beneath it all, something heavier lingered. A tension that had been building, quietly, steadily, as though the world itself sensed that something irreversible was approaching. Jesus walked among the people, not hidden, not distant, but present, as he had always been. And yet, there was a shift. Something in the air had changed. The pattern that had followed him, that had shaped every impossible moment before, was drawing inward, focusing, narrowing, toward a single point. Night fell. The world grew quiet in the way it does before something breaks. There was no fire from the sky, no sea splitting open, no voice calling out from the elements. Only stillness. And then, it began. Betrayal. Not by enemies, but from within. A moment that did not reshape nature, but revealed something deeper. That even within the unfolding of something greater, human choice still remained. He was taken, not by force alone, but by agreement, by decisions made in shadows where light did not reach. The movement through the city was controlled, deliberate, leading to a place where judgment would be carried out not by the laws of nature, but by the will of men. The trial was not like the moments that had come before. There was no interruption, no visible intervention. Only silence, where there might once have been something more. The crowd gathered. Voices rose, not in wonder, but in demand. And for the first time in this long pattern, nothing changed. No fire descended, no voice interrupted, no unseen force altered the course of events. The process continued, step by step, toward death. The weight of it was different, because every moment before had shown control, power, authority over the structure of the world itself. But here, there was restraint, a deliberate absence, as though the pattern had reached a point where it would no longer prevent what was coming, but allow it. The sky dimmed, not suddenly, but steadily, as though the light itself was withdrawing. Hours passed, yet the darkness did not lift. It settled over the land, unnatural, heavy, pressing down on everything beneath it. Those who stood there felt it, not just as darkness, but as something deeper, a shift, the boundary being crossed. The moment came. Breath slowed, stopped, and with it, silence. Not the silence of night, not the silence of waiting, but the silence that follows an ending. The pattern had reached its limit. Or so it seemed, because death, once complete, does not reverse. It does not hesitate. It does not release. The body was taken, wrapped, placed within a tomb carved from stone. A barrier set, sealed, final. The stone stood as a declaration. This is the end. Time moved forward, one day, then another, and another. Nothing happened. No movement, no sign. Only the quiet certainty that this moment was no different from any other death that had ever occurred. But beneath that certainty, something remained, something unresolved. Because everything that had come before had not led to an ending. It had led here, to this stillness, this pause, not of time, but of expectation. And then the morning came, not marked by sound, not by warning, but by absence. The stone was no longer where it had been, moved, not broken, not shattered, but displaced, as though whatever lay behind it no longer required it. The tomb stood open. Inside, nothing. The place that had held death now held emptiness. At first it was confusion, disbelief, because absence is harder to understand than presence. A body can be seen. An empty space raises questions. Then, realization. Not immediate, not fully formed, but growing, spreading. Something had happened. Not seen, not witnessed, but undeniable. Death had not remained. It had been left behind. The pattern, which had bent the world step by step, had now crossed its final boundary. Not by avoiding death, not by delaying it, but by passing through it and emerging beyond it. Alive. Not restored in the way Lazarus had been, not returned to what was, but changed, different, as though death itself had been confronted and overcome. And with that moment, everything that came before took on new meaning. The fire that did not consume, the water that transformed, the sea that opened, the food that appeared, the stone that gave life, the animals that spoke, the river that stopped, the sun that stood still, the walls that fell, the fire that could not burn, the hand that wrote fate, the lions that did not kill, the depths that did not claim, the water that held weight, the dead who rose. Each one a step, not separate, not random, but connected, leading forward, building toward a single point. This, the moment where the final rule was broken. Because if death itself can be undone, then nothing remains absolute. No boundary remains fixed. No law remains beyond reach. And that is where the story leaves us. Not with answers, but with a question. If these events were not isolated, if they were not simply miracles, but part of something larger, something deliberate, then what are we looking at? Ancient history, divine intervention, or fragments of something far older and far less understood? The whispers remain, carried across time, hidden in stories that refuse to fade. And now, they have reached you. The question is no longer what happened. The question is, what do you believe they mean? Thank you for staying with Forbidden Lore until the very end. If you've made it this far, then you've walked through fire that does not burn, crossed waters that should never part, and witnessed the moment where death itself was no longer the end. These stories are ancient, but the questions they leave behind are still very much alive. Because somewhere between myth and memory, between faith and mystery, there are truths that refuse to stay silent. And here, on Forbidden Lore, we continue to coj those truths. If this journey stirred your curiosity, if it made you question what lies beyond what we think we understand, then this is only the beginning. There are many more stories waiting in the dark, stories forgotten, stories hidden, stories not meant to be remembered. So make sure you subscribe to Forbidden Lore, turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. And if this video drew you in, take a moment to like it. It helps these stories reach others who are searching, just like you. Now, as the night grows quiet around you and the world returns to what feels normal again, remember, some stories end, but others continue long after the telling is over.